Aloha, my name is Edward Wade Fowler, and this is my final video project for Anthropology 460. During the semester, while we were learning different theories on globalization and hybridization, I was also reading in my personal time various texts on Japan and the history of Japan, which ranged from historical Japan in the olden times all the way up to more modern Japan. And while doing so, I was able to draw many correlations between the texts that we read in class, written by Jan Peters, Globalization and Culture. So for this video presentation, I would like to take the two different things I learned and merge them together so we can see the application of the theories that we learned in class and how they apply to society in general, and more specifically, how they apply to Japan historically and also in modern times. So I hope that you enjoy the presentation. To begin with, I would like to raise the question of what is globalization? As we learned throughout the semester, there's a lot of debate around the term globalization and to what all globalization encompasses, especially when you take into different fields of schools such as business, psychology, and things like that. But for this video project, globalization is just going to be a representation of any form of crossing between boundaries of different cultures and people, leading to the hybridization of culture and advancement of what they were by combining different things on kind of a larger scale. So with that, I would like to set into chapter 2 of Peters' book called Globalization and Human Integration. In this, Peters argues that we were all immigrants at one time. If you look at our stories, regardless of where our families come from, we have an immigrant story. Generally, we come from somewhere else, oftentimes across the sea, especially if you're from the United States. And at one point, we immigrated here, and that kind of shows that there's no such thing as a pure culture. And when you relate this idea to Japanese culture, many of us will think, wow, Japan seems to be very homogeneous compared to cultures found within the United States. However, this necessarily isn't the case, and this is represented through the history of Japan. Peters also argues that globalization is a deep historical process, and when we look at the history of Japan, it's where this point really becomes clear that even the Japanese people at one point in time were immigrants. For example, if you go back to as early as they can trace Japanese inhabitants within the Japanese archipelago, you can see that there was distinctly 3 separate groups of people that occupied the region back in the Neolithic era. The first group was referred to as the Ainu tribe, and they resided mostly in northern Japan down to mid-central Japan. And then in the south, you had the Ryukyuan group of people who actually were more focused within a group of islands found between the Japanese mainland and Taiwan. And then in the middle, you have a third group that kind of seems to be one that is still up for a lot of debate as to where they came from, but it's generally accepted that they came from Southeast Asia somewhere. And this central point of Japan is where all 3 groups made contact with each other. It's where they would meet up with each other. And it's interesting because these groups really don't carry historically any of the characteristics that we affiliate with Japanese culture. For example, if you look at the Ainu tribe, they are more genetically similar and culturally similar to many of the Polynesian tribes. In fact, many historians have debated that they even came from Polynesia at one point in time. And one interesting thing that they do, which is totally not affiliated when we think about Japan, is culturally they would believe that the bear was a god, and they would raise a bear from a cub up until it was an adult, and once it reached adulthood they would actually sacrifice it to receive the blessings of the god. And so you really don't find that in Japanese culture nowadays because other ideas have kind of came and pushed them out. Well, if you go to the Japan that we understand now, they've actually kind of absorbed these three groups into one, and so you see this hybridization. You see this really melange of people turning into one on a smaller scale than what we're seeing in the world today. And so this really gives us a foundation for the Japanese history and how we can see that everyone at one point in time was an immigrant. Now I would like to move on to our next step. So now that we have an understanding that everyone at one point in time was a migrant, their people came from somewhere, and we kind of see historically how globalization was taking place before we even coined it as a term, we kind of transition now into the bigger history view of Japan as a group of people, as one group, as opposed to three individual groups within the Japanese archipelago. So when you look at Japan historically, many of the attributes that we think of when we affiliate a thought towards Japan is the product of different arts and crafts that came out of a period known as the Heian Jidai. And this period ranged from 790 AD all the way up until 1118 AD. This Heian Jidai period mostly took place in the region known as Kyoto, which is one of their famed cultural cities that a lot of tourists like to go to today. And within this, we receive the Japanese cultural ideas of governance, art, poetry, and war, music, all kinds of stuff. Anything you could think of Japanese affiliated, this time period really shaped it into how we know it in Japan nowadays and as foreigners. And even though this is where we get these characteristics that we affiliate with Japan, these were all the derivatives of hybridization and globalization that took place previously within Japan. And many of these attributes they have actually came from the Chinese mainland. For example, if you look at the governing body within Japan, you have a divine leader, which is equivalent to the emperor, and then below that you have different ruling houses throughout Japan, and within those houses they have a court, and the court is set up kind of like a village within the kind of upper class living quarters, and that consists of blacksmiths, craftsmen, artisans, all kinds of stuff, the necessities that Japan needs to be able to build the upper class. And then you also have some that are kind of unique, such as the daimyo, which were the ruling samurai who consisted of these houses. When you look at them really though, all of it can be retranscribed back to China, and we can see the same government formation appearing there, and so quite interesting. If you take this point even further and you look at the Japanese written system, you can also see that even though it is very unique and different from other Oriental countries, it also was derived from China. For example, one of the main writing systems used in Japan is called kanji, which was borrowed from the Chinese Hanzi, and it is the Chinese script. However, when Japan borrowed it, they realized that it didn't quite fit their language as well as they would like, because they had future tenses, past tenses, and things like that. So they derived on their own a second script known as hiragana. Hiragana was used to write verb tenses and words that didn't have a Chinese character equivalent. That way the language could fit into their, or the writing system could fit into their language easier and better. In addition to this, you also have another third syllabatory system in Japanese referred to as katakana, and they use it to write foreign loanwords that didn't exist in Japan, but they borrowed it. And if you even look at the word for thank you in Japanese, arigato, it is even heavily debated that that word wasn't even Japanese in origin, but was actually something that appeared in the 1600s, 1500s time when Protestant missionaries came over from Spain, and they believe they took it from the Spanish word like aribato or something like that, which means thank you. So in our next step, we are going to take a closer look historically on how hybridization and clash of cultures occurs with globalization. When looking at Japan historically, we can also continue to dive deeper into Jan Peters's book, Globalization and Culture, especially when we look at Chapter 3, Globalization and Culture and the Three Paradigms, as well as Chapter 4, Globalization as Hybridization. So in Chapter 3, Peters argues that whenever there's globalization, there's going to be a clash of cultures, and it can get very violent because one culture is going to fight for dominance over the other culture, and eventually they're kind of just going to absorb each other and create this hybridity of a culture. Well, as we could tell historically in Japan, this took place with the three original groups of people that they can distinctly identify within the Japanese archipelago in olden times, as well as the Heian-kyo. However, when these clash of civilizations and cultures occur, there's always people who are going to support it and promote globalization and the exchange of new ideas. However, at the same time, there's people who are against it, and they're more conservative in nature, and they want to preserve their culture. And that really leads to some big debates that we see in the United States now as to what is the right way. And so it's all up for debate. However, in Japan historically, this also took place, and it began with a guy named Oda Nobunaga. So Oda, he ruled for 47 years in Japan. He was originally from a prefecture known as Gifu. And before he took power, the Japanese political system was having trouble because the Buddhist priests had so much influence in Japan, it almost ousted the political influence from the daimyo and other political leaders. So he saw them as a threat, and he wanted to take action to kind of ensure that they would never be able to have political influence within Japan because it threatened his power. And so he went around and he burned down a bunch of churches, and, well, I should say he burned down a bunch of Buddhist temples, and he actually wanted to promote something that would kind of push back against Buddhism and weaken its flow even more. So he accepted Christian missionaries, and the most common missionary during the time were Jesuit missionaries from Portugal, and they came in and they had a lot of success. They brought these new Western ideas about a savior and things like that. And during that time period, back in the 1500s, there was more converts to Christianity than the LDS Church has in Japan nowadays. And even though the Jesuit missionaries had a lot of success, there was hybridization going on a smaller level within religious ideals. For example, the Jesuit missionaries would bring in the idea that Christ was the Savior and was the reason that they had life. However, the Japanese, even though they accepted the idea, they would kind of hybridize it by kind of having the image of the sun god for Jesus Christ. That way they could kind of connect and affiliate it with it better. And so this took place through the remainder of Oda Nobunaga's life. However, following Oda Nobunaga, there was two daimyo that really disagreed with the new worldview that Japan had towards accepting other cultures and bringing in new ideas, because they in turn saw that it was also a threat to their daimyo lordship. And so there was a man named Hideyoshi and also Ieyasu Tokugawa who decided that they needed to stop this influence of foreign powers and stop the hybridization taking place in Japan. And so with Ieyasu Tokugawa, he actually imposed some of the strictest isolation doctrines that we've ever seen in a country. If you were to compare it with anything today, it's arguable that North Korea is the closest affiliatable country to the state of Japan during this time, which was actually a 300-year period that lasted from the 1600s all the way up until Commodore Perry entered Japan in the 1800s. And so during this period, if you were caught practicing Christianity, you were tortured and executed, and they made an example of you. and many of the Christians went into hiding, and they are referred to as Kakure Christians, or hidden Christians. And any foreigners who happened to make landfall in Japan were also executed and were made a public image to deter any foreign influence within Japan. If anybody wanted to travel during this time period, you would have to have special permits to allow you to go anywhere. And they had one of the most extensive spy networks for an older government system that would just ensure that everybody was keeping to what Tokugawa felt was the ideal Japanese way of life, and if anything opposed it, they were prosecuted by the daimyo and sentenced to death. So as we look at this historical aspect of isolation within Japan, it's something that we often affiliate with Japan, thinking that they were always isolated, but that wasn't always the case. However, it brings us to the question of when did the isolation end and when did globalization resume within Japan? Well, this takes us up into the late 1800s when Commodore Perry arrived in Japan with warships from the United States, and he kind of performed a Hawaiian haiku and said, "You're going to sign this treaty with exclusive trade rights between us, or we're going to start war on your country." And so, seeing the technology they had and how guns were far superior to the bow and the katana, Japan realized, wow, we need to get our butt in gear and start to industrialize. That way we compete with it. We can compete with this. And Japan was seeing this as a major threat because they also had intelligence and historical understanding that China was currently facing this problem with the British, and the British colonial system actually led to the fall of imperial China, and to Japan, a small country looking out towards the outside world and seeing these powers slowly taking over with colonialism, it was a scary thing, because even though they were trying to preserve themselves by isolation, they realized that it was no longer going to work. Hybridization and globalization would eventually arrive on their shores also, which it did with Commodore Perry. And so when they looked at China, Japan generally regarded it as the most powerful country in the region, kind of like a mother country. And so they knew if China could fall to it eventually, they would fall to it unless they took drastic measures. And so this led to one of the most impressive industrialization transformations historically that we have account of. And in a matter of a few years, Japan was able to create a modern civilization based on industry, backed by the politics found in Western countries, as well as war machines such as navies and militaries. And with this, we see a transfer of west to east technology, where Japan would take military technology such as the battleship, build it, look at their culture and their social system, and take what they felt was more advantageous and place it within these technologies to make it something better. And so this eventually, as most people know, led to World War II, and as we also know, Japan was defeated in World War II by Allied powers. And so this drastically set Japan back and led to probably its most greatest flux of globalization and hybridization to take place within the country. And so following the war, American troops began making landfall in Japan, and there's been an occupation within Japan governance area ever since World War II by the United States. And this has definitely left a mark within Japan and kind of the culture, how it's evolved and changed. There's been a lot of intercultural marriages and things like that, and Japan is really seeing a change in their cultural values, because they're at a point where they have to accept hybridization or else they can't survive in the modern world. And so even though this took place within Japan, Japan pulled off another miraculous feat that is well comparable to their advancement into industrialization, and that was the building of the world's second best economy. And they held that position for quite a number of years until China took it just this last year. This position is next to the United States, of course, and this was done through the car companies such as Toyota, Subaru, etc., and also in technology such as Sony and the production of computer equipment and semiconductors. And so this leads us to the modern era, and up to this point you can still follow globalization and hybridization, how it got them here, how they had opposition to it, how it's created a clash of cultures, and this is going to take us into the next part. So now that we are in the modern era of Japan, historically as we look back on it, we often see what Jan Peters referred to as the transfer of influence from west to east. However, with this more modern era of Japan, we see so much globalization going from east to west, or different ideas that originated in eastern countries such as Japan, Middle East, and things like that, and their expansion into western countries such as England, the United States, and Australia, Canada. So in Japan, one of the biggest things that kind of began the shift from east to west globalization was the toy company Toyota. So Toyota had a very unique business model in how they did things, which was drastically different from business models within the United States. However, Toyota was very successful in how they did things, and Western businessmen began to pick up on these ideas, and it led to a plethora of books on the subject. One of the most famous ones is called The Toyota Way, and it sold hundreds of thousands of copies in Western countries. That way businessmen could understand this new economic world power, how it was so successful, and how they could apply it in their own countries to increase their success. So in addition to this, currently right now, one of the most influential and undeniable things that we see coming from east to west is animation films. Japanese anime seems to be a pretty big deal within Western countries. You see these weird cultural events, well, to me it's weird, to some people it's normal, that are comparable to the Electric Daisy Carnival, called anime conventions. And at these anime conventions, people go there to discuss different animated films that are coming out of Japan, and they dress up as these different characters, they meet up, they have parties, they have fun, and it's quite an interesting phenomenon to see. But it's because of Japanese influence coming out of the country and going to the West. Sometimes these influences go from east, west, and then back to the east. This is evident also in Japanese anime, where it was derived in Japan. Certain series were added onto within the United States. They did well in the United States and were actually translated and remarketed back into Japan with these new extensions. One of which is, I believe it's called Full Metal Alchemist, Dark Brotherhood, or something like that. That's one I read about online. And so when we look at this, we can see more of the modern day hybridization and globalization that's taking place in Japan. And when you look at Japanese culture, it is far different from Japanese culture just 70 years ago. And that's because there's so much cultural influences from the outside world arriving in Japan. And Japanese people, they have this interesting ability to see outside influences, new technology, and they grab it, they utilize it, they learn it, they understand it, they make it their own, and then it becomes unique to Japan. And so when you think about the melange within cultures and this idea that Peterson talks about, where eventually hybridization is going to lead to just kind of the rounding out of cultures and people into one group. I think you see this in Japan historically, and you also see it happening right now. For example, historically, you had the three distinct groups. They kind of fused into one in the Japan that we think of today, which was within the Japanese archipelago, their own melange. However, you're seeing it on a much larger scale, a more globalized scale, on a world level between Western countries and Japan. To bring this video project to a wrap, I would like to recap on everything that we discussed up to this point. As you can see, from the historical environment all the way up until modern times, many of the theories and ideas discussed in Globalization and Culture, the Global Melange by Jans Peters, are applicable, and we can see how they apply in our lives nowadays as well as in Japan as a society. And we could see this in the original people who migrated into the Japanese archipelago, which highlighted that we're all migrants ourselves and we all have a backstory where we came from somewhere else, and we were the product, currently we are the product of globalization. And also you could see historically that there was people who support globalization and hybridization, but at the same time there's many people who oppose it. And you can continue to look into Japan today to see how globalization continues to work. And because of digital technologies, globalization is expanding at a much faster rate than it did previously. But ultimately, it has always been present. Hybridization has always been taking place, and cultures have constantly been changing. And so I hope that this video presentation and the application it has towards Japan through the theories we learned in class will help build your understanding of how we can utilize this knowledge. So thank you very much. Have a good day and mahalo.